I wonder what your assessment is of what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment from Russia. Is this the beginning of the spring offensive? Are things going to hot up a lot from this moment?
Well, we were expecting maybe a more emphatic beginning to this, but it does now look like we're beginning to see this offensive. The pressure is coming in several places. It's not overwhelming at this moment, and that is going to tell us a lot about what the Russians can really bring. But because we're seeing pressure in multiple places, I do believe this is probably the leading edge of that offensive. And yes, it will probably cause some concerns for Ukraine across the next weeks.
Well, how do you think they will withstand this onslaught? They're asking for missiles, they're asking for jets. They're clearly not going to get what they say they want immediately. So, do you think Russia will start to gain the upper hand in a way it hasn't really in the first year of the conflict?
We have overestimated Russia so many times. I'm being very conservative. I am not expecting Russia to come out with a big flashbang attack. And I do believe that Ukraine will have to struggle with it. They may have to give up some ground, but I don't expect the Ukrainians to be overwhelmed. What we have seen for sure is that given the equipment they need, the Ukrainians are operationally and tactically superior to the Russians, and so I think they'll manage.
That's fascinating. And so when they ask for these jets that they're asking the US for, they're asking, they've been going around, President Zelensky has been going around Europe and before that the UK asking for jets. There's been a lot of explanation here in the UK that the jets we have are not the most suitable. The US ones, on the other hand, the F-16s, are perhaps more so. Do you think that request will be answered by America? Do you think those jets will be forthcoming?
Well, in the short term, no. Sadly, we have become the nation of no and not. But over time, a lot of our no and nots have turned into supply. We said no and not to the Patriot. We initially said no and not to the anti-tank missiles, et cetera, et cetera. But over time, we come around to the right position and we move forward. I do appreciate the UK's leadership here. We are in America sometimes these days seen as leading from behind, and the UK is leading from in the front on some of these issues. And I think that the UK is taking the right tact. But we have stopped calling for a specific aircraft because my country has said no to that aircraft. What Ukraine needs is a multi-role fourth plus generation aircraft that can do air defense when it needs it, but most importantly, can precisely strike ground targets when it's not doing air defense.
I mean, do you think there is a justification in President Biden's reticence on these issues, in that the more that the US gets involved in the UK, Europe, the more that we all become targets for Putin and we're embroiled in this war?
This is exactly what Mr. Putin wants us all to think. His army is largely failing. His disinformation and influence campaigns are succeeding wildly. What does he do? He continues to threaten the West with nukes because he knows that's what scares us. And about every 2 or 3 weeks, he raises the this is World War III, and your Western soldiers are going to die on the battlefields, because he knows that's what dissuades us. And so he has carried on a magnificent campaign of deterring the West, and we are deterred.
But then
And so
some of those fears are perhaps justified. I mean, the Times today is reporting that Ukrainians are prepared to use British missiles in Crimea, bringing us more directly into conflict with Russia. There could well be reprisals from that, couldn't there?
how much more directly involved with a war with Russia can Ukraine be? Russia has a world power, has used its military to cross internationally recognized borders and have invaded and occupied portions of a neighboring country. They have weaponized rape. they have weaponized torture, they have weaponized murder, and they are now exporting, we believe, well over 14,000 Ukrainian children into Russia to repopulate their demographic problems. So
Mm,
I'm not sure how much more Ukraine could be in war. Now, if you're talking about the US and UK, we are supplying weapons to a nation that is under attack from a belligerent who has just stepped over every boundary
yeah.
in wartime.
No, I was talking about the UK becoming more embroiled and therefore sort of being sucked into conflict. But let me just ask you what you think Putin's goals are now. What do you think he wants out of this next phase of the war, and how do you see it panning out? How long do you see this going on for?
Well, I think the most important thing Mr. Putin is doing now is he realizes he's not going to be able to conquer Ukraine like he thought in the beginning. And he also realizes that Ukraine is dependent on resupply from the West. And so I believe now he wants to outlast the West. He knows that if he makes this last long enough, that support will falter, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's what he's trying to do. And he's accentuating all these things. You hear him talking almost every day about how many years this is going to be a long war. We're in this for the long term. And he continues his information, disinformation, deterrence campaigns to try to separate the West from Ukraine.
But
I
we
think he fully understands right now that his army is not going to defeat Ukraine unless the West gives up on them.
well, so then we're potentially looking at a very long war here, are we?
I don't think so, because my hope is that the West will come to the policy decision to give Ukraine what it needs to defeat Russia and expel Russia from Ukrainian lands. Russia, remember, I mean, I hate to keep going back to it, but Russia invaded now for the third time Ukraine and is occupying the lands of a neighbor.
Mm.
And I think it right and proper that the West give Ukraine what it needs to expel Russia from its lands.
And so, if the West does give the missiles and the jets that Ukraine's asking for, how quickly could this war be done, in your view?
Well, that really depends on how much we give them and how much we support them with the resupply that they will need. The first and most impactful thing is not going to be an aircraft. If we give them the ATACMS like missile, or many more of what the Brits are giving them, the Storm Shadow and others, if we give them these longer range missiles so that they can attack the length and depth of Crimea and make Crimea uninhabitable for the Russians, then the war will come together rather quickly. The aircraft are going to be something that Ukraine needs in the future. Whether they impact on today, they're going to need them in the future because they're going to continue to have this belligerent Russia on their borders.